The lantern flickered against the cabin window, the first light Mason Reed had seen there in 10 long years. Blood from the wolf he'd just killed still warmed his hands in the bitter Wyoming cold. The December wind howled across the empty plains, carrying the promise of another brutal winter. Mason's breath frosted before him as he slowly dismounted, his weathered body tense with suspicion. His Colt 45 hung heavy at his hip, a constant companion in these lawless territories 40 miles from Cheyenne. Strangers meant trouble, rustlers, claim jumpers, or worse. Mason had tracked the wolf pack for 6 miles after they'd attacked his southern herd. One by one, he'd put them down with the cold precision that had kept him alive through the war between the states and 10 harsh years alone. But now someone waited in his cabin, someone who had no right to be there. As he pushed open the door, the creak of worn hinges announcing his arrival, what he saw made his blood freeze colder than the Wyoming winter. A woman sat in Catherine's chair, reading Catherine's diary by candlelight. Golden hair cascaded over her shoulders like wheat in summer wind, the same delicate hands that had once touched his face, the same graceful neck that had haunted his dreams for a decade. Catherine, the word escaped his lips like a prayer to a God he'd stopped believing in years ago. She looked up, and those familiar brown eyes met his. But the face was younger, harder somehow, alive in ways his wife was not. Mason's hand moved instinctively to his gun. "I'm Victoria," she whispered, "Catherine's sister." In that moment, every carefully built wall around Mason Reed's heart began to crumble. 10 years of solitude, 10 years of faithful mourning. And now this, a ghost made flesh, sitting in his dead wife's chair, reading her most private thoughts. "Get out!" His voice was gravel, worn down by years of disuse. "I can't do that," Victoria said, closing the diary with deliberate care. "Father is dead. His will stipulates that I must bring you back to Philadelphia, or his entire fortune goes to Cousin James." Mason's jaw tightened. James Bennett, a name he'd hoped never to hear again, a snake in fine clothes who'd never worked an honest day. "Your father made his choice when he disowned Catherine for marrying beneath her station." Mason stepped fully into the cabin, his spurs jingling against the wooden floor. "I made mine when I buried her out back with my bare hands." Victoria stood, unafraid. "James sent men after me, 3 of them. They'll be here by morning." As if summoned by her words, a gunshot cracked through the night. The window behind Mason shattered, sending glass shards flying. He lunged forward, tackling Victoria to the floor as bullets splintered the wood where they had stood seconds before. "They're early," Victoria gasped, and to Mason's surprise, she pulled a Remington revolver from the folds of her dress. "You know how to use that?" Mason asked, already calculating angles, exits, ammunition. Victoria's eyes hardened. "I've changed since Catherine left home. We all have." The war that had shaped Mason Reed was long over, but as he checked his Colt and prepared to defend what was his, he realized that some men never truly leave the battlefield. Tonight the past had come calling with loaded guns, and Mason Reed would answer. The first attacker died before he cleared the tree line. Mason's shot caught him center mass, a clean kill. The remaining 2 split up, circling the cabin like wolves. These weren't common bandits. They moved with military precision. "They're James's men, all right," Mason muttered, ducking as another bullet shattered what remained of the window. Professional. Mason had prepared for trouble. Years of solitude had given him time to fortify the cabin against any threat. He dug a shallow trench beneath the floorboards, a fighting position that had saved him during more than one Apache raid. "When I give the signal, shoot at anything that moves by the north window," he instructed Victoria. "Don't stop until your cylinder's empty." She nodded, her face pale but determined in the dim lantern light. Mason crawled to the back door, staying low. He'd built this cabin with his own hands, knew every loose board and weak spot. Catherine had laughed at his paranoia when he'd insisted on 2 exits. She wasn't laughing when the blizzard of 77 had sealed the front door shut for 3 weeks. The memory of her laughter, so clear after all these years, nearly broke his concentration. "Now!" he shouted, bursting through the back door as Victoria's Remington roared to life inside the cabin. The night erupted into chaos. Mason moved like a shadow in the darkness, using skills learned tracking rebels through Virginia swamps. The second man never heard him coming. Mason's hunting knife found the gap between his ribs before he could cry out. The third attacker was smarter, more cautious. His bullet caught Mason in the shoulder, spinning him against the cabin wall. White-hot pain lanced down his arm, but years of hard living had taught Mason to push through pain. "You can still walk away from this," the man called out, his voice carrying the refined accent of Eastern money. "Mr. Bennett only wants the woman." Mason's response was a bullet that grazed the man's ear. The attacker cursed, returning fire wildly before retreating toward the tree line. His footsteps crunched in the snow, fading into the darkness. "He'll be back," Mason said grimly, stepping back into the cabin. With more men. Victoria lowered her smoking Remington, her hands remarkably steady for someone who'd just been in her first gunfight. "You're bleeding." Mason glanced at his shoulder. The bullet had torn through muscle but missed bone. He'd had worse. "It'll keep," he said, but Victoria was already rummaging through her traveling bag, pulling out bandages and a small bottle of whiskey. "Sit," she commanded, with a tone that brooked no argument. Catherine's tone. "I worked with a field surgeon during the war. I know what I'm doing." As she cleaned and bandaged his wound, Mason studied her face in the lamplight. The resemblance to Catherine was striking, but now he could see the differences. Where Catherine had been soft, Victoria was all angles and determination. Her hands were skilled, but lacked Catherine's gentleness. "Why would James send men after you?" Mason asked, wincing as she tightened the bandage. Victoria's expression darkened. "Because of what Catherine found, what she wrote about in her last letter home." From her pocket, Victoria withdrew a folded paper, worn at the creases from repeated reading. "She wrote this the week before she died. It never reached us until Father's solicitor found it among his papers after the funeral." Mason took the letter with his good hand, recognizing Catherine's delicate script immediately. His heart clenched as he read words written by a hand long since turned to dust. "Dearest Victoria, Mason has discovered something that will change everything. A vein of gold on our property, rich enough to rival the strikes in California. He wants to keep it secret, fears what men will do when driven by gold fever. He's right to be cautious. The Montana goldfields turned neighbor against neighbor. But I've seen how James looks at our land on the survey maps. He knows something. I fear what he might do. If anything happens to us, know that I have hidden the map where only someone who truly knew me would think to look. With all my love," Catherine Mason folded the letter carefully, his mind racing. "I found the gold 3 months before she took sick. Small vein in the North Ridge. Never told anyone but Catherine. James has been obsessed with finding it ever since," Victoria said. "He's convinced the map is somewhere in this cabin." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the damaged windows. A storm was coming. Mason could feel it in the ache of old wounds, the same preternatural sense that had saved his unit more than once during the war. "We've got until morning before that man brings reinforcements," Mason said, checking his ammunition. 7 rounds remaining. Not enough. "If there's a map, we need to find it now." Victoria nodded, her eyes scanning the cabin. Catherine wrote that she hid it where only someone who truly knew her would look. What was most precious to her? Mason's gaze drifted to the mantelpiece, where a single photograph stood in a simple wooden frame, their wedding portrait. Catherine in her mother's lace dress, looking like an angel descended to earth. Mason beside her, uncomfortable in borrowed finery, looking like he couldn't believe his luck. Because he couldn't. A battle-scarred former Union soldier with nothing to his name but a land claim and determination had somehow won the heart of Philadelphia's most sought-after debutante. With careful hands, Mason lifted the frame from the mantelpiece. The backing came away easily, revealing a folded parchment tucked behind the photograph. "She always said you were her greatest treasure," Victoria whispered, a catch in her voice. The map was crude but precise, marking distances from the cabin to a series of landmarks, ultimately leading to a cave system in the North Ridge. As they studied it, the first heavy snowflakes began to fall outside. By morning, 3 feet of snow had transformed the landscape into an impassable white hell. The storm had bought them time, but it had also trapped them. Victoria busied herself taking inventory of their supplies while Mason reinforced the broken window with boards from the storage shed. "We have enough food for 2 weeks if we're careful," she reported. "Ammunition is the problem." Mason nodded grimly, checking the priming on his old Spencer rifle, a remnant from his war days. Only 12 rounds remained for it, plus whatever Victoria had for her Remington. On the third day of their snowbound confinement, Victoria's cough began. By nightfall, she burned with fever. Mason felt fear grip his heart like an icy hand. He'd seen these symptoms before, in the winter of '77, when pneumonia had taken Catherine. He'd been helpless then, watching as each labored breath brought her closer to her final one. Not again. Not while he still drew breath. Through the night, Mason tended to Victoria, applying cold compresses to her forehead, forcing willow bark tea between her cracked lips. Each rasping breath she took mirrored Catherine's final days. Each fever spiked a step toward the same abyss that had claimed her sister. While searching for more blankets, Mason discovered a hidden compartment in Catherine's old trunk. And another letter, this one addressed to him in handwriting he didn't recognize. The paper was yellowed with age, dated 3 weeks before his wedding day. "Read, Catherine is to be my wife. Her father promised her to me before you corrupted her with your frontier fantasies. Return to Philadelphia with her immediately, or suffer consequences beyond your imagining. She deserves better than a penniless soldier playing at being a rancher. James Bennett." The letter confirmed what Mason had long suspected. James had wanted Catherine for himself. His hatred wasn't just about gold. It was about a woman who had chosen a life of hardship with a man she loved over luxury with a man she despised. When the fever finally broke on the 5th day, Mason nearly wept with relief. Victoria recovered quickly, her constitution proving stronger than her sister's had been. As strength returned to her limbs, determination hardened in her eyes. "We need to find that gold before James and his men return," she said, studying the map once more. "It's our only leverage." The storm passed, leaving behind a crystalline world of blue shadows and blinding white. They set out at dawn, following the map's directions north toward the ridgeline. Mason rode point, his Spencer rifle across his saddle, eyes constantly scanning for threats. The cave entrance was hidden behind a frozen waterfall, just as the map indicated. They tethered their horses in a sheltered grove and proceeded on foot, lanterns casting long shadows against limestone walls, worn smooth by millennia of running water. "Catherine never saw this place," Mason said, his voice echoing in the cavern. "I found it after she died." The passage narrowed, forcing them to proceed single file. The air grew warmer as they descended, the walls beginning to glitter with mineral deposits. After nearly an hour of careful navigation, the tunnel opened into a vast chamber, and there it was, a seam of gold running through the rock wall like a frozen river of sunlight. Even in the dim lantern light, it gleamed with unmistakable promise. But it wasn't the gold that captured Mason's attention. In the center of the chamber sat a small wooden box, Catherine's jewelry case. With trembling hands, Mason opened it, finding not jewels but a leather-bound journal. Catherine's last diary continued after the one Victoria had been reading in the cabin. The final entry, dated 3 days before her death, contained a revelation that chilled Mason's blood. I've discovered something terrible. The medicine Father sent, the tonic I've been taking for my cough, I found the same bottle among James's things when he visited last month. I recognized his handwriting on the label. He's been poisoning me slowly, hoping to claim Mason's land when I'm gone. I've stopped taking it, but fear the damage is done. If anything happens to me, Mason must know the truth. The sound of a hammer being cocked echoed through the cavern. Mason and Victoria turned to find James Bennet himself standing at the chamber entrance, flanked by 5 armed men. His fine Eastern clothes looked ridiculous against the cave walls, but the Walker Colt in his hand was deadly serious. "Touching reunion," James sneered, his patrician features twisted with malice. "I've been waiting 10 years to see this place." Mason's hand moved toward his holster, but one of James's men fired a warning shot that ricocheted off the cave wall. "I wouldn't," James advised. "Drop your weapons. Both of you." Mason and Victoria complied, their guns clattering to the stone floor. "You killed her," Mason said, his voice deadly quiet. "You poisoned Catherine." James smiled, a cold reptilian expression. "A regrettable miscalculation. The poison was meant for you, Reed. Catherine was supposed to return to Philadelphia, a grieving widow, where I would comfort her in her time of need." He gestured to the gold seam with his free hand. "Instead, she found my gift in your belongings and grew suspicious. Unfortunate timing." "You're a monster," Victoria spat. "I'm a businessman," James corrected. "And this gold mine is about to become my newest acquisition, after you two suffer a tragic accident exploring these dangerous caves, of course." Mason had survived the war by recognizing opportunities. As James monologued, Mason noted the loose rocks near his feet, the stalactite formation above James's head, the single lantern that provided most of the chamber's light. James raised his pistol, aiming at Mason's chest. "Any last words, Reed?" Mason's kick sent the lantern flying. Darkness engulfed the chamber, broken only by muzzle flashes as James's men fired blindly. Mason tackled Victoria to the ground, covering her body with his as bullets ricocheted off stone walls. "The passage to the left," he whispered urgently. "Crawl!" They scrambled through darkness as gunfire continued behind them. The narrow tunnel forced James's men to come single file, a fatal bottleneck. Mason retrieved a knife from his boot, waiting in the shadows as the first pursuer squeezed through. The man died silently, Mason's blade finding his throat with practiced efficiency. The second fell to Victoria's retrieved Remington, the gunshot deafening in the confined space. "After them!" James's voice echoed from the main chamber. Mason and Victoria retreated deeper into the cave system, using Mason's knowledge of the terrain to their advantage. They emerged onto a narrow ledge overlooking an underground river, 50 feet below. "We're trapped," Victoria gasped. The sound of pursuit grew closer. Mason spotted a narrow path along the cavern wall, barely wide enough for one person. "This way," he urged, leading Victoria along the treacherous route. Halfway across, the ledge crumbled beneath James's weight as he followed them. His scream pierced the darkness as he plummeted, catching himself on a rocky outcropping 20 feet down. His men, more cautious, held back at the tunnel entrance, unwilling to risk the narrow path. "Reed!" James called, his voice strained as he clung to the rock face. "Help me!" Mason looked down at the man who had murdered Catherine, the man who had just tried to kill them both. Every instinct honed through years of hardship urged him to let James fall. "Mason, don't," Victoria said quietly. "Not like this. We have her diary now. We have proof." Mason's internal struggle played across his weathered features. Finally, he uncoiled his rope and lowered it toward James. Grab on, he commanded. James seized the lifeline, relief washing over his face as Mason began to pull him up. When he reached the ledge, James lunged forward with a hidden derringer, his eyes wild with hatred. Die, you backwater bast! The gun discharged harmlessly into the cavern wall as Mason deflected James's arm. In the struggle that followed, James lost his footing. Mason grabbed for him, their fingers touching briefly before James plummeted into the darkness below. His scream echoed until a sickening impact silenced it forever. The remaining gunmen, hearing their employer's fate, retreated from the cave. Spring came to Wyoming territory, melting away the brutal winter. The cabin stood transformed. A new wing added, windows replaced, a small vegetable garden beginning to sprout behind the repaired fence. Mason stood at Catherine's grave, Victoria beside him. They placed fresh wildflowers on the simple wooden marker. The Philadelphia courts accepted her diary as evidence, Victoria said. James's estate is being divided among those he cheated over the years. Mason nodded. And the gold? Registered in both our names. Enough to expand the ranch, but not enough to attract unwanted attention. Mason looked at the woman beside him, no longer a ghost from his past, but a partner for his future. Different from Catherine in all the ways that mattered, similar only in her courage and determination. I'll always love her, Mason said simply. As you should, Victoria replied. She brought us together, even from beyond. In the distance, their new herd grazed peacefully, twice the size of Mason's original stock. Near the main road, a small building was under construction, a doctor's office where Victoria would use her medical knowledge to serve the scattered ranching community. They walked back to the cabin together, not touching, but close enough to feel each other's presence. The shadow of the past would always be with them. But no longer did it block out the sun. Mason Reed had spent 10 years mourning. Now it was time to live.